Well, Paul, thank you very much for that very warm introduction, and could I also thank the hosts of today's function, Canada 2020, and of course the Canadian-Australian Chamber of Commerce for your generous hospitality. Paul, I think you're right. It is the case that Australia and Canada did weather the global financial crisis and the global recession much better than any other developed economies. And of course, in doing that, we put in place a range of policies which were appropriate for the time. We both did move to stimulate our economies. We did that in a way which protected our people. But the other thing that happened around all of that was that the G20 became institutionalised as the premier global coordinating body. And I'm also pleased to say that in doing that, Canada and Australia played a very, very important role, bringing together developed economies on the one hand and developing economies on the other. It seems odd when you think about it, but so much of the emerging and developing world had never been before represented around a table representing the global economy. And in bringing all of those countries, the 20 largest countries, both developed and developing, we did something very, very special. We put in place a set of institutional arrangements which represented the modern global economy, where everyone deserves a seat at the table. And I think that goes very much to the heart of the Australian spirit and the Canadian spirit as well, bringing everybody together. And therefore it is appropriate that a G20 meeting should be held here in Canada. The G20 is a very important development for the future of the global economy, so that when we grow, we can all grow together. Because we all know that back there in the dark days of 2008, following the collapse of Lehman Brothers, there was a very substantial threat to the living standards and livelihoods of millions and millions of people in both developed and developing economies. So the G20 is something that we should value. It's important that it's here in Canada. I think it's also important for me to acknowledge today the central role that Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, as Australia's Prime Minister, played in helping make the G20 a premier economic forum, along with Prime Minister Harper. He was very committed to the G20, he worked very hard on it, and it's certainly given Australia a strong voice in the global economic debate and a seat at the table in shaping our economic future. And of course the same goes for Canada. The Australian government under Prime Minister Julia Gillard remains just as determined to see the G20 continue as a premier global economic forum, and of course for Australia to continue to play a very strong role. Now of course, as you also indicated before, Australia and Canada have many, many shared interests. Australians and Canadians have tended to view our relationship through the prism of shared history and shared values. Of course, we do have different perspectives. I could launch into a comparison between cricket and hockey, but I'll resist that. I know I'm on Canadian soil, so I'll lose the argument as to whether Wayne Gretzky or Donald Bradman was the greatest sportsman of all time. But I don't think we should undersell the substance and the significance of the Australia-Canadian relationship. And I'd also like to say that personally I've shared a very good relationship with the Canadian Finance Minister, Jim Flaherty, in achieving all of those objectives that I spoke about before. The truth is, as prosperous, resource-rich, multicultural, liberal democracies, Australia and Canada have a similar story to tell the world, and it's a great story. We draw on colonial roots and have a proud heritage of Indigenous cultures. Our paths to nationhood were also not easy. We both went to war in 1914, convinced we were British, and by 1918 it was clear that we were Australian and Canadian. We played important roles in the birth of Bretton Woods, and through the G20 we are reinvigorating the Bretton Woods institutions. We remain committed to the United Nations and its ideals, and of course here in Toronto we are all proud supporters of the G20. As two multicultural, highly educated and affluent countries, we do possess a policy creativity and capacity to build diverse coalitions that can deliver real change. And of course this does bring us to Toronto this week. Our meeting here is the fourth G20 leaders meeting since November 2008, and of course we will meet again this year in Seoul. For me personally, it's a privilege to attend my fourth G20 leaders meeting, this time in my capacity as Deputy Prime Minister. I believe that Washington, London, Pittsburgh, Toronto and Seoul will all be seen as among the most significant global gatherings of our age. These gatherings recognise that our collective contributions would be far more than the sum of our individual parts in an interdependent world economy. An act we have. We acted to prevent the global economy going over a cliff. We acted to stabilise the global economy and to put it back on the road to recovery, and of course to make sure the damage suffered by economies, by businesses, by communities and families does not happen again. Now, when historians write about the first decade of the century, two events will stand out. The first will, of course, be the tragic events of September 11, but the second will be the events in the global economy over the past 2 years and how the recovery played out. In a stunning display of how interconnected the world has become, we witnessed financial shockwaves roll right across continents to become a global economic tidal wave that threatened to rival the Great Depression. Now, it's just worth reminding ourselves how significant this event was. It does tend to recede, particularly if you're an Australian and you're a Canadian, because we have not felt what the rest of the world has felt. Global output fell for the first time since the 1930s. None of the events of the past 7 decades have ever caused global GDP to fall. Not World War II, not the 1970s oil crisis, not Black Monday in 1987, not even the Asian financial crisis. But in 2009, the collective output of the world's economies went backwards. We faced the sharpest, deepest, most synchronised global economic recession in 75 years. On some accounts, by the end of 2010, the loss in global output arising from the shock to global growth could be around US $4 trillion. The number of jobless people worldwide rose by more than 30 million in the past 2 years, and the destruction of wealth was unprecedented in peacetime. But among all of this, one fact stands out. We avoided a Great Depression. The events of 2008 could easily have spiralled into a crisis to rival 1929. But thanks to coordinated, decisive and rapid global action led by the G20 economies, that did not happen. G20 member nations came together to implement what was probably the largest, most comprehensive and most coordinated stimulus strategy ever seen. And of course, those actions brought the world back from the brink. But of course, challenges do remain. Some countries, particularly Europe, face very high public debt. And of course, unemployment levels in countries like the United States remain far too high. But none of that compares to the devastation that would have occurred without serious global action. Relative to other industrialised economies, Australia and Canada faced the global crisis from a position of considerable strength. We both implemented timely and targeted fiscal stimulus packages at the height of the crisis to restore confidence, support investment and minimise job losses. And of course, the Australian and Canadian economies are now recovering solidly. And of course, our financial systems remain sound, underpinned by strong regulation and, importantly, effective supervision. Our governments were not called on to bail out major financial institutions, in stark contrast to the experience of the United States and Europe. And of course, our public finances remain among the strongest in the world. The Australian and Canadian federal governments have both laid out clear fiscal strategies to accelerate the return to budget surpluses. Here, Australia and Canada are ahead of the pack. Australia's budget will be back in surplus in 2013. That's 3 years from now, 3 years earlier than expected just 12 months ago. And Canada will be the first of the G7 economies to get back into balance in 2015. and it's important that G20 countries move to follow our lead and put in place credible, medium-term fiscal consolidation plans. We need to accelerate financial sector repair and reform. Australia and Canada have much to contribute to the G20 debate by drawing on our strong financial systems and world-class supervision. We are both committed to stronger global standards in financial markets to rebuild confidence in global financial markets. We have to make sure we get the new standards right. Like Canada, Australia's financial system did not experience the kinds of turmoil seen elsewhere, so it is not expected to need the same kinds of adjustments. Part of getting the new standards right means ensuring they take into account legitimate country circumstances.